in answering the call for better supports for Indigenous post-secondary students, conducted a series of surveys and polls to hear from students what topics they most wanted to discuss when it came to their mental health. Indspire, in collaboration with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, have chosen the top 5 responses to address. We wanted our post-secondary students to hear from others who have walked their path, so we will be having a discussion with 2 students, both of whom are engaged in achieving their master's degrees. I am Kelly Brownbill, and I am privileged to be the moderator for this series. I am joined by Connor Lafortune and Ziigwen Mixemong.
Ane bojo, getchewa bishwa makwa Indigenous cause und dem Kins Indigenous cause. Oki kendan donjaba, beneshin dondem and ishna benin dao, and swakmakan donda. Women to goshimo, jaganashimo, mimo bangi anishnabimo, webama dizing no ke endao, minashka bewis endao. Hi, my name is Connor Lafortune. I'm from Dokis First Nation in northeastern Ontario on the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory of 1850. I graduated from Nipissing University with a double honor specialization in Indigenous Studies and Social Justice and Gender Equity, and I'm now pursuing my master's at Laurentian University in Indigenous Relations. I also work in life promotion, harm reduction, and Indigenous education.
Bojo, Ziigwen Mixemong Mongdo Dem, Jimnising Donjiba, Bodowadami Olnu Anishinaabe Kwayandao, Upading Mide Kwayandao. Hello, my name is Ziigwen Mixemong. I'm Loon Clan from Beausoleil First Nation, which is located in the beautiful Georgian Bay area of Ontario. I am also a member of the Three Fires Midaywan Society. I first started pursuing higher education with an honors Bachelor of Arts in Indigenous Studies at Lakehead University, alongside a minor in Gender and Women's Studies, and I am now pursuing a master's at Lakehead University in Social Justice with a specialization in Gender and Women's Studies. My research is focused on Indigenous reproductive rights as well as the barriers that face Indigenous women pursuing motherhood.
Colleges and universities often cite services that they offer to Indigenous students as an enticement for enrollment. Services and social activities both may seem very foreign to Indigenous students, whether they leave a reserve or an off-reserve environment. As Indigenous students are separated from community, it's inherently important that they feel belonging to a community on campus. Connor and Ziigwen, I can't wait to hear you talk about how you managed to build supportive relationships around you and still maintain connection to who you are as an Indigenous student. Connor, let's start with you.
It's really important to stay connected, whether that be to the environment that you create or the new spaces that you operate. I think without that connection, we feel really lost, especially as Indigenous people who are so anchored into our environment. When we feel like we're, floating around, it can be really difficult to feel like we can do any schoolwork or any, employment. So for me, it was very important to right away jump into finding people that are like-minded, that are also, going to push me both academically and just like in my way of thinking. And so a lot of my friends started in my Indigenous Studies classes, whether that be language classes or different things on history. We would just kind of stay back after class and start talking about the material and start, you hear people introduce themselves in their classes and you go, oh, I like that about you. I'm going to come talk to you about it afterwards. And, little by little, I built this community of like-minded folks and just being able to go on new adventures. I'd never been to, in my area, in Manitoulin Island, I'd never been out there to explore. I'd just been for specific things. And so finding people who lived out there and being able to go visit and do new activities, do hikes and join the powwow trail, those types of things are really important for me to stay connected and finally being able to do that now that I'm living a little bit away from home. Those communities that I built slowly, built other communities where I'm like, oh, I'm also a spoken word poet. So I started getting involved with the spoken word poet scene in Sudbury and in getting involved with the writers and the arts. And without those connections, I never would have been able to have the opportunities that I'd have today of being able to perform and being able to engage so beautifully with the people around me. I think a way for me to do that was just like little by little trying to see who other people knew. And I know that in Indigenous communities, we have these large networks. And so everybody is like 1 degree separation from knowing everybody else. And that can be really beautiful because then you get to meet these people that you never would have otherwise met. And you get to introduce these people to new people as well. So bringing folks to your community and realizing that they are, really well adapted to, make birch bark canoes, and then you start a workshop in your community. Like there's really beautiful opportunities that happen when you're building those connections. And to me, that was also reaching out to folks that were outside of the Indigenous community. And so activism for me is something that gave me so much community and being able to learn about folks around me, but also just making lifelong friends that I never would have made had I just stayed in my little bubble. And I think I did that for the first year and a half of university. I was very much so kept to myself. I had one or two friends, and I was really just trying to get through the academic year and really slow down. And then I realized after I transferred universities to North Bay, it was very apparent that I needed to build those connections, because I was just going to be alone, and that's not very fun, and you can't really learn much if you're just, doing assignments alone, or you just have no one else to bounce those ideas off of. So changing universities for me was a very big wake-up call to create that community, and to not be so stuck on just having my community in Dokis or just having my community in Noelville, but really building from that and being able to form such beautiful connections really across the territories that I find myself on.
That's so cool. I think that, as Indigenous people, especially for me as someone who is raised in the culture and in ceremony, that our whole spirit and our whole, I think, sense of self is really based in community. And so I think that relationship building piece is incredibly important for Indigenous students. We know that these spaces, these colonial institutions that are universities, weren't built for us as Indigenous people. And so I think that in order for us to protect our mental health and to continue to do things just like turning in assignments and doing the normal quote unquote things that you do at university, we need that sense of community to do that. We can't do it alone. And so building those relationships is such an important piece. And I also transferred universities, so I know what it was like to have to build that community and then have to rebuild it all over again. It's definitely an experience in and of itself to just have to kind of shift and realize how important it is. I think that when students, regardless of their positionality or identity, come into university for the first time, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of change, you meet a lot of people. I came from a very rural town in central Ontario, where I was the only person of color in my public school until grade 6. So when I stepped into Toronto for the first time at my first university, it was incredible to see the cultures that were there and were present. And I think that starting to build relationships with people who maybe weren't necessarily Indigenous as well, but came from maybe other communities that were also oppressed or marginalized, really made me feel a sense of kinship. And just like Connor said, activism became a huge part of relationship building for me. I mean, we want to support each other, you want to support your friends, and so if a friend is saying, I'm going to this protest, do you want to come? It really became something that was a real way to foster new friendships and meeting new people at these different activist events, you could call them. I think that I was really lucky as well, though, that I had community at home that was incredibly supportive. Community, in fact, actually funded part of my tuition. I am incredibly grateful for that. And so I knew as I was walking into these new spaces that I had that community behind me and propping me up and continuing to say, you got this. And I can't ever thank my community enough for that, because I think without that piece, not just like the monetary, I mean, that's always nice, but the other support, knowing that they really wanted me to go out there and to pursue my education, was incredibly empowering. And I was also really lucky that I was able to continue to go to things like ceremony and, the power trail, like you said, and that I was able to foster relationships across universities. I would work with other student unions, Indigenous student unions, on how best to run a university powwow. And I think that these relationships can transcend the academy itself. And I think that it's important for us to look for meaningful relationships, not just necessarily with the Indigenous people in our class, but also the Indigenous people on the campus and on other campuses. Because while we might have different experiences, we can certainly empathize and relate to each other. And I think that without the support of community, without the support of other Indigenous students, without the support of other marginalized students who maybe have also had some not so nice things happen to them at university, when those not nice things happened, I would have felt incredibly alone. Mm-hmm. And so without having formed those relationships and without having my community to stand behind me and back me up, as well as like my parents and friends and all those sorts of relationships, I don't think that I could have walked into that space as who I want to be. And so without those relationship pieces, I don't think that Indigenous people are able to really safely exist within the academy. And the institutions aren't going to give us our community safety. And so, it's both a privilege and a responsibility for us to look out for one another. And so I think walking into those spaces and knowing that you're going to learn from other students and that they're going to learn from you, and that it's okay to not necessarily, be from the same First Nation or be from the same identity group, but know that we can all learn from each other as long as we're doing it with that building relationship and that good intent and that respect, is a way that I was able to move through the university. Without it, I don't think I would have been able to even graduate my undergrad without the people behind me.
How? Two really good points there. I really like, Connor, how you talked about that organic growing of a sense of community, but we can't forget that was still intentional. You can't just wait for the wind to blow. So you intentionally set about organically building, even though that's a bit of a contradiction there. And I think that's interesting for people to know, is that although it can be a very natural way to build community around you, sometimes you do have to look for it and step into it. And let's face it, as Indigenous people, community is what kept us alive for thousands and thousands of years, right? It's not that long ago, 600 years ago, without community, we would not be here. We would have died. So it's our community that kept us alive. And I really like the idea, Ziigwen, of, finding your community with other Indigenous students, but also finding community in the rest of the population at the university as well. Everyone has a way to prop up your journey, and as students, you're all facing some challenges. So although I'm never one that likes to go to the deficit-based conversation, maybe we can spend just a little bit of time talking about what happens when you feel that lack of community. What happens, and what students that are watching this video can be on guard for their behaviors, how it felt when you felt separated from community and knew that was a clue for you to start sitting down with other students. What are those things that happen to you when you know community is what you're missing? Connor?
I think the thing I struggled with the most is feeling like community was happening without me. And not necessarily that I wasn't welcomed or that they weren't thinking of me, it's that it went on and I wasn't there to be a part of it. Something that's really, really beautiful at the same time is that my community started doing so many more activities, like bringing in makers and bringing in workshops, and I had to sit on Facebook and watch everything that was happening, and being so far away and not being able to just go. And I think that was a really hard piece for me, because although it was happening also in the community that I lived in, these weren't my people. I was looking at people that I call my aunties and my uncles, and laughing and being able to be together and craft. And that was so hard to see and so hard to witness as a young kid, wanting that so much, and finally seeing it happen without me. And so that was something that was really difficult for me, and it continues to be something that I move through. But something that was the most difficult, I think, was that when you're growing up, you're taught that your teachers and your professors and those who are teaching you, you're supposed to be able to rely on them and to trust them with your knowledge and to trust them with how you're feeling, not even intimately, but just to feel safe in a classroom. And as soon as I walked into the university and I experienced having non-Indigenous professors teaching Indigenous content, I felt unsafe. Right away, I knew that if I chose or not to spoke up, there would be outcomes of that. There would be, a change of grades. There would be conversations that I would need to have. I would need to constantly fight. And that need to constantly fight is very, very draining, and it's difficult, and we can't always be fighting because sometimes it's safer to take a step back. But that was really hard, especially as an activist at heart, someone who's very passionate about who I am, about our knowledge. I am so proud to say I'm Anishinaabe. I'm so proud to talk about our history and to know our history and to be able to learn more and to hear it so overtly told in such a negative way, such a demeaning way, and often factually wrong. It was very difficult sometimes to make the decision to not speak up that day. And I often felt like I was letting my communities down by not speaking up, when in reality what I was doing was taking care of myself so that I could continue to fight another day, and that being so important. So for me, that battle was very internal, where it was trying to decide where I felt safe and where I felt comfortable being able to push the ballot in one direction. but it being very difficult to understand like where safety was for me. And so knowing that if I'm back in my community, I feel safe. If I'm out on the land, I feel safe. If I'm with the community that I built, I feel safe. But there are so many concrete places that I have to exist where I do not feel fully, completely myself, where I cannot exist wholly. And as a queer Anishinaabe person, that is also something that plays into that, because sometimes our communities aren't always the safest. Because of the histories of colonization and the way that our knowledge has changed, it has shifted the ways that we speak about our kin, the way that we speak about ourselves in our communities. So for me, finding safety is something that I've always had to navigate. And as a francophone Indigenous person, that is not something that I always have as well, because my French community isn't always the most welcoming of my identities. So for me, like finding that intersection where I could feel comfortable and then growing from there, and then having, when I didn't feel safe speaking up, knowing that I had someone beside me that felt safe enough to do so, whether they be Indigenous or not, or queer or francophone, but being able to rely on that community that I built, earlier in this conversation, that being so important, because when I didn't feel safe, there was someone that would stand up for me in that moment. And if they didn't then, they would do it the next time. And that's something that I couldn't be more grateful for.
You really touched on something when you said, my community, I feel like I'm letting my community down. And I think that's something that a lot of Indigenous students feel, is that they're the first ones in their family to go to university. Their community is supporting them, as Ziigwen so clearly spoke about. They feel that if they don't stand up every time, that they're letting all of those people down and all of their ancestors. And that's an incredible weight to carry that you cannot carry if you're not whole. And so the first step is to care for self, as you said. And it's okay to step back and care for self, because then you're going to come back later to be able to address that.
I also think that it's important to remember that, these, higher education institutions were not built for us. In fact, a lot of the time they were built to eradicate us. Yeah. And so just being in that classroom is an act of activism. Just being present in that academy is an act of defiance. There's a quote there that like an educated native is a dangerous native, and that's good. We want to be dangerous. And so I think that was also something that, I can sit here and say it, but sitting in that classroom and going, if I don't speak up, then everyone else is going to learn something factually untrue, is something that you definitely have to grapple with. And for me, that, like you said, was when I started to feel like, I'm missing that piece of community. Because I know that if Connor and I were sitting in a class together, that I could be like, Connor, I don't have the bandwidth right now, could you please? And then Connor could do the same for me. And so I think it's important that we really, really, really focus on those pieces of relationship building, because without those, we simply cannot function. Without those, regardless of whether or not we're performing academically well, which is a whole other topic on top of just being Indigenous in the academy, then we can't actually function as Indigenous people in that space. That space wasn't made for us. I'm going to keep saying that and shout that from the rooftops, because literally just being present, just sitting in that classroom is an act of defiance. And I think that's so incredibly important for Indigenous students to remember, and to not feel alone, because we're all doing it. Every person who is Indigenous in the academy is also sitting there with you. There's a sentiment in my teachings that when you say, Anishinaabe Kwe Endau, I am an Indigenous woman, that you can't say it in the singular, that when you speak of that, you're speaking to all of those who have come before you and all of those who will continue to come after you. And I think we've seen representations of that in the media, like reservation dogs.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah. But I think that there's that beautiful, beautiful scene that we're both thinking of, where the community is just standing behind her. Her entire ancestors are standing there. And I think that when you're sitting in that class, being able to be present with yourself and realize that all of your ancestors are there with you, and that you're not alone, and that there's relationship building to be done with those ancestors, is important. And so for me, when I started to feel alone, which was to me the really kind of flag that I wasn't doing well, I wasn't whole. And even if I had, fun relationships with other students, that I needed to do some internal work as well and some spiritual work. We can't be full if we're not spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically well. And so I knew that I needed to work on that spiritual piece and talk to my grandmothers and grandfathers and talk to all those who I am intrinsically connected to, and know that I'm not alone in that space, that to me was community building. The community might not have been physical, they might not have been sitting there with me, but I knew that it was okay for my grandmothers and grandfathers to carry a little bit of that burden for me, take a little bit of that weight off my shoulders for me.
I think that's incredibly empowering to remember that, as much as we talk about the need for community, that we do as Anishinaabe people, as Indigenous people, we carry community with us, that connection to ancestors. So chimigwech for that, Ziigwen. Just to wrap up, when we think about the other students who are maybe struggling out there, who are maybe facing for the very first time challenges to their mental health because they're in a brand new relationship, maybe we can end with some advice around building supportive structures and supportive relationships around them as they walk into a place where they're feeling unsafe or feeling alone for the very first time. What advice could we give to them?
Well, following in the same vein of like that community that stands behind you, one of the principles I follow, and I actually have it tattooed, Mande Amengeyaba, which means we're still here. And the statement isn't I'm still here or my community, it's that we are all still here and we will continue to still be here. And so when we think of feeling isolated, feeling alone in the classroom, of not only remembering that we are collectively here, we are taking up space, we are teaching and we are learning and we are doing this beautiful relationship, but also that there are other people feeling that same way, that also feel isolated, that might look at you and say, I wish I had everything that they had. They are so connected, and might not know your experience, but there are other people that are looking towards you to share with them. And I know that it can be so intimidating to go to like the Indigenous office the first time and feel like you will not be welcomed in. And sometimes you're not welcomed in, and that's not on Indigenous culture being unwelcoming. That is an individual taking it upon themselves to not welcome you, and that is an experience that we've all had, and it is terribly hard to want to reach out to another person after that. But there are things that we can do as student leaders. Often the mandate for the Indigenous student circle, this is what we call it, Laurentia, but there are other versions of that. It's to help Indigenous students. So if you're struggling with something, you go to your office and you go, hey, I would like help with this. And they go, perfect, we'd love to have another event. We've been just trying to think of what to do, and now you've given us an idea. There are so many ways that reaching out can be so beneficial. Asking for medicines, asking to sit down with an elder, a knowledge holder, an auntie, an uncle, sitting by the fire with a shkabewis or a firekeeper. Those little moments in between where we might not think are life-changing, but you walk out of those spaces feeling refreshed, feeling good, going for walks, those types of things for me, they sound so simple, and it's so hard to want to do those things when you're feeling terrible, because it's just like, what is a walk going to do? And then you go for a walk and you're like, oh, I guess it changed my life. It's really that simple sometimes, of just being able to connect, but taking that first step towards reaching out and really seeing the people that exist around you. And if you don't have those spaces in your university, demand them, because they have a responsibility to have them.
Absolutely. I think that my advice was going to be, don't be afraid to demand things. Truly, especially when we're talking about community and relationship building, don't be afraid to demand that the university or the academy or the college or wherever you're studying gives you space, because you deserve it. You are here. We are all still here. You deserve to have that space. It is not something that is a privilege. It is a right for you. And so I think demanding that, and also in that same vein, not being afraid to do away with relationships that aren't benefiting you. I think that I was so starved for community, moving away from my own, that I really grasped on to a bunch of different people, and then I realized that maybe those people were also suffering from a trauma, or just weren't healthy, or just weren't someone that I really wanted to be friends with anymore. But I held on to them for a little bit too long because I was worried about feeling a loss of community. But I think my advice would be to remember to put yourself first, demand those spaces, and be okay with saying, thank you, I've learned enough from this relationship and I'm ready to move on. It's something that is okay. You don't have to be best friends with every other Indigenous person on campus. You know, we come from a multitude of different backgrounds. We come from a multitude of different, even just identities. So it's okay to find your community and protect that, and to protect yourself through that. And I guess that would be my biggest advice, would be to put yourself first and demand those spaces 100%.
I think that's